Mostly I grew up on like Soviet era literature. This is all post Soviet.
Most of it, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, Grossman is another guy that I think is absolutely brilliant. I don't know if you've read his stuff. He did one on Stalingrad, and he had a couple of others that are just brilliant. Spent some time in gulags, just like Solzhenitsyn.
I'd love to get a reading this.
It's on my class reading. It's like all these entertainment books, and those are the ones I list.
Yeah.
So I'll talk to you after this. Yeah.
No, that would be really good. There's a what was this thing? There's an anthropologist who studied magic in post-Soviet Russia as a kind of a means of control, sort of compensatory control, because all of the social kind of norms had fallen apart, and so all of the business dealings were accompanied by magic transactions because the trust had eroded so much, and it kind of moves into this, there's all of these post-Soviet era kind of magical and sci-fi works that these worlds.
Anything or know anything about those magnets in Siberia? Have you ever heard that the Soviets were looking at parapsychology and
There's a CIA also doing that.
that's it. And the
One of them was
KGB too, so.
They get off topic here. So.
Yeah.
Men who stare at goats, that's the kind of parody.
He had to dematerialize, as I mentioned.
Good to see you.
I think this is just one of the perks. I used to know some of the people the Soviet era experiments, not as scientists, but as the people who would try to make things happen.
Oh, I see.
And I just completed a
Sounds like they had a lot.
psychedelic assisted therapy certification, so I'm going to be moving into this kind of territory now. And working on studying around.
Are you working on the next project study?
Yeah, I'll be one of the therapists, yeah. I can't, she comes to this Dharma class, this community sit that I lead sometimes on Monday night. It's so glad to see you here.
Yeah, you too. I'm Ronnie.
Yeah. Yeah, it's exciting. Hola.
Patient turning into
Hello, nice to meet you. Yeah, officially, right? How you doing? Oh, you don't look good.
Sure.
It's too hard to get into
Is it?
If you want to do it,
It's also Brian's birthday today, so I figured the consciousness planes are merging here. Something was meant to happen.
sunset.
Really got the piano.
Should we just unplug or something?
Unplug? I think it's fine. I pressed the button. Hello, everyone. Are we recording? IT support?
Yes, we're recording.
Okay, good.
Voice from above.
We are,
Real.
we are transmitting also. This is going out.
Yes,
Airwaves.
yes, we are. We are live.
All right.
Say something else.
So, hi, I'm Rael. I'm the director for the USC Center for Mindfulness Science, and really grateful for everyone who's joined today in person and on Zoom. I've been asked by our guest speaker, Roman Palitsky, who's with us from Emory University, the Center for Psychedelics and Spirituality, to play the role that I suggested that he might want to play as part of his talk. And so I'm going to do that. But before doing that, just to say this is a presentation as part of our series on mindfulness. And as those of you who are aware of the direction of the center over the last 6 years know, over the last couple of years and last few months in particular, we are including quite a bit of content from experts in not just meditation and mindfulness, but also psychedelics in our speaker series. So this will be a continuation of that effort. And I'm just going to start with a 5-minute practice. So I just suggest that you find a comfortable position for your body. You might want to unburden yourself of any unnecessary items. Thoughts, feelings, emotions, stress. And closing the eyes if you feel comfortable doing so, or allowing them to stay open if that's more comfortable. Coming into the present moment, being here now. And if you find it useful to have some directions to follow with your mind, you can take a few slower, deeper breaths, allowing the body to relax with each out breath. Noticing the natural expansion of the lungs, the belly, on the in-breath. Contraction of the belly, the lungs, and the out-breath. And staying present to what's happening here and now in the body with this breath. You might feel the breath more prominently in the belly and the lungs, expanding and contracting. Or at the entrance to the nostrils, upper lips. Slightly cooler breath coming into the nostrils, rushing by this part of the body. Slightly warmer breath in the out breath. as the body is breathing, staying alert and attentive to each passing moment's experience of this breath, this moment, arising and passing. And if you find it helpful to stay with the breath, staying with the breath, or expanding awareness to the body as a whole, sensations, contact with the seat, contact with the floor, the sensations from the top of the head to the tips of the toes. Each passing moment, sensations arising and passing. Being here for all of it. And if you feel comfortable doing so, expanding the attention even more broadly to the feelings, the emotions, the sensations of the body, and the thinking. The sixth sense door. And the silence out of which thinking arises and passes. So, thank you for joining me in that. Dr. Roman Palitsky is an assistant professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences and the director of research projects in the spiritual health at Emory University. His work in psychedelic treatment research seeks to make psychedelic therapies rigorous, effective, and accountable to the many patient populations who might benefit from them, and to support those care seekers who may experience adverse effects. Roman has a PhD in psychology and a master's in divinity from Harvard, and I will let him give the rest of his introduction. For now, I just thank you so much for being with us today, and take it away.
Thank you for this introduction. Just bear with me while I switch the screen so that we know where I'm gonna this. Okay. Are we all looking at the same screen? Very good. Okay. Thank you so much, Rael, for that introduction and for that wonderful grounding practice to start us off. I'll clarify, my PhD is not from Harvard, it's from the University of Arizona, and I'm very, very proud of that. I'll just say that I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. And then,
divinity from?
that is from Harvard. So I'm going to start today's talk by sharing a story that happened to me back when I was 20. So here's me back then, the time I was living in India and riding my motorcycle up from Goa into the north, into the mountains. And at that time, I had not really done much meditation or yoga, but I kept hearing about this Vipassana thing. I kept hearing that it's going to change my life and that it's kind of like being in the Marines for meditation. It's really hardcore. So without knowing much about it, I just went ahead and signed up for a Vipassana course. And I traveled to Dharamsala to sit my first 10-day retreat. So I'm still incredibly grateful for the track that that retreat put me on. I found the insights, the lessons, and the attunement to the capacity of consciousness that it brought to me to be personally life-changing. But that isn't the part that stands out for me right now here in front of all of you. The part that stands out was that around day 3, I started to hear someone in one of the dorm tents crying. And this continued day after day until eventually the crying was so awful and had increased so much that it was beyond sobs. It sounded guttural, terrified. And I remember having this thought, like, well, this person must really be doing their work. And that's just how it goes when you're in that process. And that was all. I had a wonderful rest of the retreat, and eventually the crying stopped. But the person was also nowhere to be seen, and they probably just left the center. But now I remember this person as much as I recall the wonder of that first retreat experience. And I sort of think, where did this idea come from for me? That they must be doing some kind of deep work. Was it this thing that I kept hearing from the instructors, that a meditation retreat is like psychological surgery? And how did it so easily extinguish my own natural response to go to someone who was clearly in such deep distress? So since then, through all of my training and my research, I've remained interested in these kinds of questions in various ways. And part of that eventually included working with an organization called Cheetah House. And Cheetah House helps meditators who experience distress and provides support for thousands of individuals every year. And that experience for 2 years during my postdoc has been incredibly formative for how I think about the kinds of challenges that we'll be talking about now. So if my 20-year-old self had known then what I know now, I wish that I could have acted very differently, that I could have said to hell with this vow of silence and just gone over there and seen what was wrong and to see if I could help. And so much of the work that I'll be talking about today speaks to issues that can arise in the midst of these powerfully transformative experiences. And hopefully as a community of clinicians, scientists, and fellow travelers, it can help us to pay more attention. And it can help us know how to respond when we see someone in that kind of distress. So given my training as a clinical psychologist, my research in psychedelics is generally focused on the clinical science and on improving the psychotherapeutic aspects of these treatments. And in today's talk, I'll describe what's become an important pillar of my work, together with others at the Emory Center for Psychedelics and Spirituality, improving the understanding of psychedelic adverse effects. And that's part of a larger mission to develop safe practices, which requires recognizing, avoiding, and responding to harms when they occur. So I'll share a little bit about the state of the science on psychedelic adverse effects, some of the unmet needs in psychedelic adverse effects research, and I'll describe how many of the tools and frameworks from meditation in science can translate to and add value to the study of psychedelic adverse effects. So I was actually, there was an earlier version of this talk when I was going to talk about the meditation related challenges later, but talking to a few folks, I kept getting this question, well, like, what are meditation adverse effects? I didn't know that there were any. So I figured it might make sense to give a sort of a primer on these. And so first of all, I'm not here to say, you know, don't meditate, don't teach meditation, meditation is bad for you. That's not at all true. We know that meditation practices are recognized for a variety of benefits. And one of the reasons that the story I started with is so relevant to me personally is I'm one of the people who benefited and continues to benefit from meditation practice. And also we know that some meditators experience challenges that vary in characteristics, duration, and severity. And this is actually not such a mystery, and it's not necessarily new. This has been recognized historically in the meditation traditions and religious traditions that have taken contemplative practices seriously. So we know this, for example, as Zen sickness, as meditation sickness, as lung syndrome. And it's been characterized for several hundreds of years at least that these things can happen. But the contemporary Western scientific models of meditation have been more hesitant to engage with meditation-related adverse effects up until relatively recently. And now that research has grown and we see some epidemiological research. For example, a study by Goldberg and colleagues found approximately 32% in their population sample reported some kind of meditation-related adverse effects. Several literature reviews documenting different types of adverse effects that can show up with meditation, and increasingly analyses of trials and studies of meditation interventions that are doing the work of documenting what happens when adverse effects show up in meditation practices. So I think it is unlikely that any of this research would have happened without the work of Willoughby Britton, a psychologist at Brown University, and Jared Lindahl, a scholar of religion, also at Brown, who've dedicated their careers to studying meditation-related adverse effects. And those of you who've been around long enough might remember some of the early days of that work. So for example, this write-up in The Atlantic, The Dark Knight Project, which simultaneously plays on Batman and St. John of the Cross, but referencing this thing that can happen in the midst of a mystical journey where one does find oneself in a dark night. That work began with Willoughby's own experience of meditation adverse effects. And that's really her story to tell, but you can hear her tell some of it in a recent podcast called The Retreat, and I encourage folks to hear it. The Dark Knight research culminated in a massive, highly detailed qualitative study called the Varieties of Contemplative Experience Project. So what they did was they recruited 60 experienced meditators who had experienced challenges related to meditation and 30 meditation experts for extensive interviews. The VCE project did the careful work of categorizing the phenomenology of meditation-related adverse effects and identifying risk factors that led to better and worse outcomes. And that included 59 categories of adverse effects across 7 domains. And really these domains, I think it's worth pausing and looking at these because we'll see that there's quite a bit of translational relevance to what we're doing in psychedelics. They identified a cognitive domain, which entails changes in the thought process, changes in how people think, but also broader cognitive changes like changes in worldview, how you see your place in the world, perceptual changes and sensory changes, changes in affective and emotional and mood experience, so either increased lability or blunting or intensification of affect. Somatic changes might include just change in physiological processes, pain, sleep, things like that. Cognitive, which is kind of a fancy word for motivational or having to do with drive, right? So changes in goals, changes in striving or effortfulness. And another place to pause even more is this category of changes to sense of self. And this is something that has become important both in the meditation research, but also increasingly in the psychedelics research, where we see this kind of narrative, which has some empirical justification, that changes to sense of self may be responsible for a lot of the positive changes that we see with these transformative states of consciousness. Things like ego dissolution, things like self-other emergence, things like developing a more porous self-boundary. And all of these can be very positive. But think for a moment what might happen if that loss of sense of self was complete and lasted beyond the experience. So for those of you who are in the room here, how would you get home? Right? And this isn't something that's hypothetical. This is something that through the years working at Cheetah House, talk to these meditators, talk to these folks who had this kind of change to their sense of self that they found to be profoundly impairing in the longer term. And then the social category, which described changes in social functioning, relationships, attachment relationships, romantic relationships, things like that. So Britton's team translated the VCE study domains into a brief interview that they could provide to participants who participated in meditation studies to measure the rates of adverse events that they experienced. The study was published while I was a postdoc in Dr. Britton's lab, and it examined rates of adverse effects in a dismantling trial of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. So mindfulness-based cognitive therapy is a kind of mindfulness-based program that teaches sort of standard mindfulness. In a dismantling trial, what it does is it takes the components of the mindfulness intervention and separates them out, comparing them to one another. So it took the open monitoring component of open monitoring meditation, focused attention, and the whole MBCT package in 3 separate arms. So when we examined the rates of adverse effects, we found that 83% of participants reported some unintended side effects of mindfulness, not necessarily negative. Now, 58 of those had a negative valence. 37% had a negative impact or were described as having a negative impact on their lives. And this category of lasting bad effects includes negative impacts that persisted for longer than a day. So 14% of participants described lasting bad effects of over a day, 9% over a week, and 6% over a month. And I will come back to this study later because I think it has remarkable relevance for psychedelics. For example, in a recent presentation that I attended on a widely publicized psychedelics study, when they were talking about the possibility of adverse effects, this is the image that they showed from a mindfulness study. So I think that that might be for 2 reasons. One is that there really is very little research that has adequate richness and adequate specificity on adverse effects in psychedelics. And 2 is that the similarities between the 2 kinds of interventions are really rather striking. And so I'll just list here some of the findings in the literature, and some of this is work that we've done that have described the different kinds of adverse effect experiences that can occur. So one is, as we've discussed, alterations in sensory and perceptual processes. There's this phenomenon of energy-like somatic experiences that people describe, which is the sensation of energy moving through your body. Again, often this can be quite positive for people. People also describe this as sometimes a Kundalini-like experience or a Kundalini awakening, but sometimes people feel like they've just plugged their finger into a socket and they don't know what to do about that. Fear and terror states. Changes in sense of self, which I discussed.
My bad.
That is a change to the sense of self. Where was that voice coming from? Changes in worldviews. And importantly, a number of influencing factors that meditators have found to be pretty important for what happened after they started to experience challenges. And this would include things like the religious and philosophical frameworks that they had at the time of these adverse experiences and also preceding them. How were they making sense of these experiences and their meaning? The interpretations that were offered by others. So are you going through a Kundalini awakening? Are you having a manic episode? Are you experiencing something that's just bad luck, right? These are all very different framings, and they entail very different kinds of response. And it was especially meaningful when those interpretations were offered by teachers or guides in the settings of meditation. And again, this is something that we think is probably, we see showing up a lot in the context of psychedelics. So as it turns out, these issues appear to be very relevant in psychedelics. And this plane was built when meditation was up in the air. And it probably can help a little bit with the journey that psychedelics are on as well. I'm sorry, I'm going to pause for a second. My phone keeps buzzing and it's distracting. So in the next part of the talk, I'm going to transition to our work in psychedelics and specifically characterizing psychedelic-related adverse effects. And I'll just pause here to sort of point out we are in a series of lectures in a mindfulness center, which is increasingly having talks about psychedelics. All right. We see this in the culture, this co-use of meditation and psychedelics, and we kind of get the sense that there is this very big overlap in the effects of psychedelics and intensive meditation. I'm not here to give a talk on the phenomenology of the psychedelic experience or really of the meditation experience, but I'll just point out that it's largely not the areas that set them apart, psychedelics and meditation, that bring us into the same rooms over and over again. You know, when we think about the physiological effects of a psychedelic substance, the transience, the fact that it affects you without you really having to do anything at all, right? That's not why all of these books were written, right? That's not why we have entheogenic, psychedelic, spiritual traditions that go back thousands of years. It's these other components that really have the capacity to orient a person and shape and change their life. So in the next part of the talk, I'll focus again on the adverse effects, but a lot of it comes from those transformational capacities of these substances, which often we use for good, but which in this case, I will be talking about the adverse characteristics. So a little bit about the state of the science on psychedelic-related adverse effects, and I'll start with the good news. First, just a broad definitional point. When I say psychedelics, I am using a very broad, inclusive definition. And that's because I'm focusing primarily on impacts today, on the ways that these can affect people, rather than the specific compounds and chemicals and the distinctions between them. So generally speaking, we understand that psychedelics are considered to be safe, barring several important rule-outs, and provided that they're used in carefully controlled conditions. We know that they have relatively low abuse potential. So this is a now classic study, although it was published in just 2018, documenting the harm potential of different substances of abuse that was published by Matthew Johnson and colleagues. And here we see sort of magic mushrooms, LSD, and ecstasy, all the way to the lower end of the spectrum of potential harms. And we know that serious adverse events are reported at quite low rates in trials of psychedelics. And in fact, just May 3rd, there was a bulletin from JAMA Psychiatry that describes a recent systematic review that found that the acute effects of acute adverse effects in psilocybin resolved generally within 2 days, which is fantastic news. So just a little bit of terminology. Here I'll be relying on the Office of Human Research Protection's definition. An adverse event in this case is any abnormal sign, symptom, or disease that's temporally associated with the subject's participation in research, whether or not it's considered related to the subject's participation. So if you experience something that's negative or untoward while you're in a study, whether or not it's due to you being in that study, it's important to report it because causality is sort of a separate matter. We figure out causality later. A serious adverse event is sort of a higher bar. And these are very concerning events that entail risk to safety, risk to a person's life, the possibility of birth defects and things like that. So from recent trials, we have a pretty rosy picture. Recent USONA study found that although 76% of participants who took psilocybin reported adverse effects, most of these resolved and most of these were not serious. Only 8% reported any serious adverse events. In a COMPASS study, they found 84% of people reported adverse events. Again, typically resolved, serious adverse events in 10%, although there was some concern about increased suicidality for some patients in that study. Recent phase 3 trial of MDMA also observed higher rates of physiological adverse events in the MDMA group, but equivalent rates of psychiatric adverse events in both groups. So again, given the broad effects of these substances and the seriousness of the conditions that we use them to treat, this is a pretty good profile. And so here's the rest of the news. I'm going to rely a little bit on a recent systematic review by Joost Brieksema and colleagues that looked at all of the different clinical trials that were available at the time, all of the findings, and they summarized the adverse events that they recorded. Again, they came up with a very similar picture. Generally speaking, these seem to be quite safe, and also they observed that this is likely to be an undercount. So why would we be undercounting adverse events in psychedelic trials? Well, there's a few issues. One is historically, psychedelics research has relied on something called passive monitoring, which is when we just ask people to tell us if anything went wrong, if anything negative has happened, which we know is not a really good way of logging adverse events. People aren't great at, or often aren't willing to report something negative. A low frequency of adverse event assessment or follow-up. A focus exclusively on the acute dosing, right? Just what happened during the non-ordinary state of consciousness, rather than in the days, weeks, and months that follow the experience. And again, going back to the point earlier, the acute dosing is not why people form religions about these compounds, right? It's all of the other stuff that happens around and after the use of the psychedelic. And again, we go back to that review, which again, I think, probably accurately reported that these acute adverse events typically resolve, but we're just not assessing anything longer term. And then there's this issue of non-systematic assessment, where they found a great deal of heterogeneity in the way that adverse events were collected, categorized, and reported from trial to trial, which makes it very difficult to bring them all together and say something meaningful about the profile of adverse events. And finally, I think is the issue that I'll be spending most of the time today talking about is the problem of restricted criteria. So for example, here is the list of adverse events that were reported from the COMPASS trial. And we see primarily physiological adverse events, acute adverse events, and a relatively narrow band of psychiatric effects that probably don't deal with the kinds of impacts that people remember or think about when they recall the longer term effects of their psychedelic experiences. And this has been observed in the follow-up or in the subsequent USONA study, where they write, moreover, psychedelics may produce adverse events not captured by standard rating scales, or may induce unrecognized new psychiatric conditions, even as they improve target syndromes. So this is also important. You can benefit and still experience an adverse event. And you can experience an adverse event and still benefit. So these are not mutually distinctive. There's also a little bit of cause for concern that even in well-designed clinical trials, some events may be going underreported. And I'll describe here some developments that followed the proposal by Lykos Pharmaceuticals for using MDMA to treat PTSD, or MDMA-assisted psychotherapy to treat PTSD. And there was a report compiled by the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review that made a couple of observations that I think are very relevant to today's conversation. So here's one. We heard repeatedly about pressures to have the results of the MAP trials be favorable. Some participants feeling pressure to report good outcomes and suppress bad outcomes when they were in the MDMA arms of the trials. Additionally, for those who were part of the community, some participants felt they could be shunned if they reported bad outcomes, or that it could lead to future patients being denied the benefits of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. We heard that positive reports generated positive feedback and negative reports generated negative feedback. We heard that this is a particular problem in people receiving MDMA as it makes them particularly suggestible and susceptible to context. Here's another observation, which I think may be even more important for this, for what we're talking about today. We heard firsthand and secondhand reports of extremely severe negative outcomes for participants in the trials that do not seem to have been attributed to the treatment by the trial researchers. Some patients were told by their therapists that their negative outcomes were evidence that they were responding appropriately and would eventually improve. Some patients were prevented from entering the long-term follow-up study and felt this was done to keep these negative outcomes out of the data set. So I also want to add that a large group of clinicians and researchers involved in the Lykos study have authored a thoughtful and thorough response to these concerns. And it's definitely not my intention to adjudicate these challenges here. But I think that the takeaway here is that participants have experienced adverse events that were not captured. And this is something that we should not allow to take place in psychedelic research or psychedelic care because it can impede our capacity to meet the people who experience these challenges where they're at and provide them the kind of care that they deserve. Outside of the clinical trials literature, we do have a little bit of research based on population studies. So in a study by Simonson and colleagues, they surveyed 613 individuals who have done psychedelics, and 6 out of 10 of them reported having no challenging experiences, which is wonderful. 9% reported functional impairment that lasted over a day, and 2.6% sought medical, psychiatric, or psychological assistance after their worst experience. We don't know if they had other experiences when they sought that kind of assistance, but we know that during the worst experience, that's what happened. So 2.6%, again, this is not a terribly high rate by any stretch. And also consider that in the US, as of the 20-teens, approximately 22% have tried psychedelics. The US population has 258.3 million adults. So if we take 22% of that, multiply it by 2.6, we arrive at 1.5 million individuals, if these findings generalize, who would have sought medical, psychiatric, or psychological assistance after that worst psychedelic experience. We also know that these rates are likely to increase. So we know the poison control calls for psychedelics have tripled between 2018 and 2022. And the rates of emergency department visits and hospitalizations have increased about 50% from 2016 through 2022. And so we're in a position where psychedelics, for legitimate reasons, have conjured a great deal of hope. Their use is increasing, and the standards for clinical care that we're going to arrive at are well underway. And yet we may be missing crucial safety issues. Like with meditation, the prospect of enduring challenges is something of an open secret for those who've been around the space long enough. And now that the plane is taking off, we're in a position of having to build the safety structures while we will help it fly. So to do that, I think it's important that we characterize and understand psychedelic-related adverse effects. That will enable us to inform harm reduction efforts and ground ethical and transparent practice. And the case that I'm making here is that meditation research can be an immensely useful building block for improving psychedelic care, owing to the overlap in effects, the social reception, and the measurement considerations that have been developed over years of study in harm reduction and safety in meditation. So now I'll transition to some of the systems that we've developed for evaluating adverse events in psychedelics. So for nearly 2 years, we've been working on a model that can characterize those adverse events that appear to be relevant in and reported in psychedelics, but which appear to be missing from the assessment of adverse events in trials. So the VCE study that I described earlier, that focused primarily on phenomenology. And what we're doing is more intended to monitor adverse events in clinical trials. And so here, an adverse event is something that represents worsening from baseline and also includes some degree of distress or impairment associated with it. So we developed a system with 53 criteria across 7 domains. And first I'll mention, there's this really important class of adverse events that come out of psychopharmacology research that, again, we see documented in the COMPASS trial. Largely, these rely on established dictionaries and rating systems in clinical research, such as the Medical Dictionary for Regulatory Activities. And basically, we didn't assess that anything was missing from those. So as far as physiological adverse events and typical clinical effects of pharmacologics are concerned, we're doing a pretty good job with that. It's the other stuff, the stuff that seems to be specific to psychedelics, that we aren't capturing. And that includes these 53 criteria across 7 domains. So these include a sociocultural domain, which can include experiences like increased stigma, increased community strain, a behavioral domain like harmful substance use, social withdrawal, or impulsive behavior, affective, cognitive, and metacognitive changes. So that would include changes in goals, striving, or sense of self, psychospiritual adverse effects, and psychotherapy-related adverse effects, which I'll be talking about later in much greater depth in this discussion. Perceptual adverse events, these can be sensory changes or illusions, and interpersonal adverse events, which can mean heightened dependence on others, relationship distress, things like that. So like I mentioned, I'll focus more on these two, the psychospiritual and the psychotherapy-related adverse events later. But I want to show another parallel between the meditation research and the psychedelics research. So as part of our work, wow, it looks really big on this big screen. We did a review of all of the different measurement tools and instruments that might be used to measure these different criteria. So all of the boxes represent different domains. The rows inside the boxes represent different categories within those domains. And the columns each represent an instrument. So the X's are the areas of overlap or capture. So domains that are captured by these instruments. So to spare you the hard work of counting X's, I'll just point out that among all of these different instruments, it was the MET-X1, the instrument developed from the VCE study, to capture adverse events that had the largest catchment, the largest capture of all of the different criteria that we identified with psychedelics. So in the interest of time, I'll focus on just these 2 domains today, psychospiritual adverse effects and psychotherapy-related adverse effects. And in fact, it's the psychospiritual effects of psychedelics more generally that were probably my route of entry into this line of research. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about these because I think this is the part that, surprisingly, we find ourselves having to make a case for over and over, even though for folks who've been in the psychedelic world or who've done their share of psychedelics, it seems to be a much easier argument to make. So I'll start by introducing an acronym, and this acronym is SIRT. It stands for Spiritual, Existential, Religious, and Theological. And we talk sometimes in the study of psychedelics or meditation about these mystical type experiences. And these are transient but transformational experiences where the self is transcended, your experience of time is changed. There might be a sense of acquiring new knowledge and having made contact with something real. And those are very important. We think that those are worth studying. And I have started to move towards this CERT framework because I do find it to be more inclusive. And I find that it speaks more to the variety of experiences that people can have, not just during psychedelics, but also in the time and during the course of life before the psychedelic experience, as well as after. And we're really indebted to our colleagues, Sandage and colleagues at the Danielson Institute for developing this framework, which we've borrowed. So to discuss the kind of impact and centrality of these CERT experiences, let me just share a little bit of kind of like a mini literature review with you. So these are a set of different studies with different compounds, different populations, different indications that seem to demonstrate what's known as a dose-response relationship between the psychedelic dosing and the CERT impact. So the greater the dose of the psychedelic, the higher the likelihood that somebody will have a spiritual, existential, religious, or theologically relevant experience. And here's another little miniature review. Now, these are not comprehensive. This is just a subset of studies that also demonstrates a relationship between the CERT impacts and the beneficial effects of psychedelics. So in a study of psychedelics, if somebody experienced the CERT relevant experience, they were more likely to report benefits from the psychedelic. So from a clinical science perspective, this looks a lot like something that we would call mediation. Mediation is any time that you have a treatment, let's say psychedelics, that changes its outcome, for example, depression, by affecting some kind of third variable, in this case, CERT. So in ordinary psychotherapy, when we see a mediator, it's usually a good idea to make sure that you can address that mediator in your therapy model. So consider the bond between the therapist and the client. If in psychotherapy,
Okay.
What's that?
Is it okay to ask a question?
Well, let me make this point I'm making, and then we'll pause. In regular psychotherapy, if you can enhance the bond between the therapist and the client, that therapy is more likely to succeed. And that's why we build things like therapeutic rapport into our therapy models. So the jury is actually still out on whether CERT is going to be a mediator in psychedelics. We're waiting for more evidence. But another reason to address CERT is the ample evidence that CERT impacts occur in psychedelics routinely and that they're deemed important by participants who have them. And in fact, it seems that the scope and the relevance of CERT in psychedelic care is quite considerable. So maybe I'll pause here because there was a question from the audience, from Rael.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you could repeat the question for the Zoom folks, that'd be helpful.
I sure will.
So one is just you chose CERT, which we in psychiatry refer to all the time, with another meaning.
Yes.
Right? That was accidental. The serotonin transporter specifically is what we usually think about when we hear CERT.
It's what we see in philology and the study of language, and we call it a false cognate. So when you use words that sound the same, but they have two different meanings, pure coincidence, but I take it as a propitious one. Yeah.
So my question really about it is the differentiation between what you are referring to by these four different words that have some overlap of meaning in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
And in particular, religious versus theological.
Mm.
The distinction there would be useful to understand. And then, it's hard for me to disentangle existential from spiritual as well. But in particular, I just would say, I think what you're referring to with regards to there's already evidence to suggest the mediating impact of mystical type experiences on beneficial effects from psychedelic dosing is the mystical experience as quantified through the mystical experience questionnaire developed by, initially Ponky and then, refined by the group in Hopkins. And are you saying that that is one or the other of those four different components of search? Or a part of all of them? I'm just trying to understand.
Let me see if I can encapsulate that question. So I think it was a two-part question. And one is, how do we define and tell apart the spiritual, the existential, the religious, and theological? And the other part was, where does the mystical type experience fit within all of this? I think the second part is actually a little bit easier to answer because I think that it can have relevance for all of those frameworks. So if somebody's not religious and they have a mystical type experience, it's probably going to be more existentially than religiously or theologically relevant for them, which leads us to the question, what do we mean by these terms when we use them? That could have been today's talk. So rather than going into it too deeply, I will invite you to read our paper. We published it in JAMA Psychiatry last summer, where we provide brief definitions of these terms. But for now, just sort of to illustrate, so spirituality is kind of, again, anytime that you define these things and you have a religion scholar in the room, you're going to be wrong. I'm just gonna say that. But for the interest of operationalizing, so spirituality would be a concern with what is deemed sacred. Existential concerns the limits of human existence and our attempts to grapple with those. Religious is the traditional, social, and diachronic, so across time, ways of carrying spiritual practices and knowledge forward. And theological is the intellectual understanding of those systems. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so by having all four words in this model, is the implication that theological, intellectual understanding is a separate and necessarily additional thing to consider as part of the mediation?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that we don't pay enough attention to theology in these. Theology has kind of become a dirty word, but this is sort of a little bit of a tangent. I think that there are implicit theologies in a lot of the psychedelic care that we provide. If you say that there is no such thing as a bad trip, and that if you come into it with a pure heart and you're going to do well, that may not be so different from a prosperity gospel, right? Theologies, one of the things they do is they make sense of suffering. And they make sense of it in light of the traditions and the societies and the histories that we live inside of. And so I don't think that we can abandon those. Especially for the many people around the world who are religious and who have theologies and who care about theologies. I also think kind of in that same vein, when we talk about mystical type experience, I have very close, dear friends and colleagues who have dedicated careers to studying mystical type experiences and to validating these measures. And I think that what the work that they've done is good work. And I also think that there is some cultural boundedness to the way that we think of the mystical type experiences, that, did you or did you not have a complete mystical experience? Maybe they'll ask me that at the pearly gates when I show up, but I don't know if that is really the most important thing that we could be concerned about here. It's a measurement instrument. And going back to this mediation pathway, so I was thinking of a systematic review authored by Coe and colleagues that examine kind of the mediation argument. And they actually, basically there's just not enough data, right? Part of the reason is testing mediation requires a lot of participants. And that's why I'm saying that the jury is still out. We have the A path of the mediation, likely, and we have the B path, although not all the time. Not all the time. It happens, I think, more often with with substance abuse treatment. But that's another reason to think of CERT, because people can have a moment of insight, right? An experience of profound existential insight and not really have that full mystical experience, but that doesn't make their the spiritual import of what they experienced any less. So I'm going to continue with the presentation. I hope that additional sort of comments and questions are going to keep rolling in. When we published this article and we were working on it, one of the things that we did, and maybe this will kind of help fit the pieces together for why we think this is so important, we included a kind of a non-prescriptive but a descriptive map illustrating the points of contact between CERT and the different aspects of psychedelic care. And so I'll just kind of take you through that map a little bit. And so I think of psychedelic therapies as a kind of a package treatment, right? You're not just giving somebody the psychedelic the way that you would prescribe a pain medication, for example, right? So it includes a set of preparation sessions with a facilitator in order to learn about the experience, prepare for it, do some orienting and intention setting perhaps. Then there's the dosing session or sessions, followed by some integration sessions that help to incorporate and make sense of the experience within the person's life. And that treatment is offered to the care seeker. Well, who is the care seeker? It turns out that there's a lot to them, and those various details matter. So we can think of it in terms of the individual and intrapersonal dimension of their genetics, their symptoms, their beliefs, their medical history, their particular worldview. Those are in relationship with a broader social and community sphere or dimension, which might include their attachment relationships, their social relationships, their roles in their communities. And these exist within a broader cultural and collective domain that might include history, human geography, economy, and culture. And so I don't think I'm telling anybody in this room or online anything new here, right? We're pretty familiar with models like this by now. But what I want to point out is that CERT influences occur at each and every one of these levels. So for example, at the individual and intrapersonal level, we might think about a person's religious or spiritual beliefs about their condition, the meanings that they make, and the coping strategies like prayer or meditation or other kinds of spiritual solace. At the social and community level, we might think about the resources that communities of faith can offer, but also the demands that they make of us. And at the cultural and collective level, we can think about interreligious histories that have shaped us and who we are, as well as legacies of collective resilience and trauma, which shape our spirituality and our religions, and also are shaped by them. And I don't think I have to make this point too strongly today, because I think all of us had to navigate a maze of fences and wires, which showcases how we are living inside of these histories right now. And so this isn't just abstract. So all of this can inform how we do the assessment in psychedelic therapies. And I'm not suggesting that we have like a 300-item questionnaire that we give everybody, but when we do a intake, that we take a spiritual history and that it informs how we continue the assessment, including identifying certain risks and vulnerabilities that people might carry, and also helping us to tailor the psychedelic-assisted therapies that we provide. So at the individual level, this might look like engaging the person's own CERT understanding of their condition. It might mean understanding their developmental influences. Did they grow up in a religious household? Did they deconvert? Did they deconvert into something that somebody who wants to say, this is definitely not spiritual? Well, we should respect that. At the social and community level, we might think about relational interventions and relational care. And I think this is where something like ritual and ceremony can become really vital, really important. And at the cultural and collective level, we are not experts on how our care seekers come to know the world. And that means practicing a lot of epistemic humility. This means that they are the authors of understanding their own experience. And again, recognizing that the history is not just something abstract, but something that we all wake up into every single day, and which means practicing that historic sensitivity, practicing culturally inclusive care in a non-appropriative way, and supporting the collective resilience of our care seekers, so that all of that can be how assert integrated care might look like. But importantly, and this takes us back to the theme for today's talk, it can help us to identify and respond to adverse events when they occur in psychedelic care, when they abut these spiritual, existential, religious, and theological issues.
Is this a figure in that paper?
Mm-hmm.
Because this, to me, identifies, it's so fundamental to all of medicine. And I think the one thing that's, we'll talk about it later, but what the driving force that, let me just say your field, Rael's field, is that you think of this in great centers of excellence, which go beyond medicine, whatever, you've seen our billboards, we barely touch that first green circle. We touch genetics and symptoms, and that's where it stops. And we take nothing else on this pathway into consideration in healthcare. You'll meet somebody this evening, she's doing a lot of outreach in the community, and this is exactly the thinking. For example, really fast, is that COVID inoculations, vaccinations. The #1 center for vaccinating Hispanic population was at a community center. And they actually had shamans, spiritual people, be there to accompany people to come in. So Keck did 1/50th of what 2 blocks away did, the community center. Mm-hmm. And they think nothing of this. And it's absolutely shocking. I wish I could take this and just put a billboard in Keck up on our, going beyond medicine or whatever that term they have this week, and show them this, because this is exactly the type of thing that you people, your field, this field is thinking about. And because I think you're doing, I wouldn't say top down, bottom up, let's call it sideways into the field. And it's just remarkable because this really touches upon it. So I'll talk a little bit more later.
Yeah, and I just want to, for the folks online, I'm going to try to summarize, and you can tell me if I'm wrong. But basically,
no, actually, it's not, because some of them I don't want them to know what I said.
Okay, I won't summarize. I think that's something to point out is this model, right? So a lot of this suggests 2 things. One is, I think, as a whole, the field of psychedelics, if it is a field, has been relatively insular. That there is a lot of wisdom and science and knowledge from a lot of disciplines. We've been doing research on spiritually integrated psychotherapy for probably 60 years. Good research, right? There are extensive meta-analyses. There's research on culturally integrated care that has had a very thorough legacy that we just kind of have not integrated yet. Let's put it that way. There are ideas about, again, this mystical experience feature, right? So the notion of a perennial, universal mystical experience is something that has largely been extinguished in the academic study of religion. Not extinguished, but kind of other ideas have surpassed it. Probably 60 years ago, maybe 50. And I think, part of what we're doing is playing catch up. This model here is, I find it to be very useful, but the reason I said it isn't anything new is, this harkens back to Bronfenbrenner. This harkens back to the socio-ecological model of medicine. It's also the biopsychosocial model, right, of care. These are all different ways of kind of introducing things that we already know work in medicine. And to showcase how powerful these connections are when they work, we get the field of public health because of collaborations a while back between clergy and doctors in order to treat epidemics, right? Where there was important outreach to clergy communities, to the people who were on the ground in helping to identify the sources of contagion. So absolutely. And I think, the more we embrace these kinds of models, the more we can provide quality care. And I think that's one of the really great things about what's happening in psychedelics is it does cause us to give a second look to how we're doing clinical science, and maybe to make some improvements in our methods and in our practices. So I guess I don't need to belabor the point that this issue of restricted criteria, right? One of the restrictions is that we are missing these CERT impacts when we assess adverse events. And again, CERT impacts can be quite positive. To have an experience of emergence or union or forgiveness in the eyes of divinity can be profoundly healing. But what happens when these effects are adverse? The experience of anomie, of abandonment, of damnation, right? Which can also happen. And I think if you're interested, I invite you to read a phenomenal essay by Rachel Peterson in the Harvard Divinity Bulletin called The Theological Reckoning with Bad Trips, which describes how even after previously positive experiences with psychedelics, it's possible to develop adverse effects that have a profoundly spiritual quality, and how these adverse effects can endure and persist for some time. Now, notably, Peterson's experience, although it began after taking psychedelics as part of a trial, it was exacerbated after going on a meditation retreat. So in this model, in order to accommodate these experiences, I'll just share some of the categories and criteria that we have brought into the sort of psychospiritual domain. And these would include existential distress, distress about loss of coherence, meaning or purpose, core aspects of existence, mortality. Kind of a subset of existential distress would be anxiety about mortality, right? Not like something is happening to me and I'm going to die, but oh my God, I'm mortal. Spiritual or religious struggles that happen inside, kind of at the personal level, but also spiritual and religious struggles that happen within one's own community. Let's say being rejected from a community that rejects psychedelic use, and now you have to go back, and now you've lost all of your social support. Undermining of a spiritual worldview. So the experience of having your spiritual views and values violated or undermined. Religious or spiritual abuse, which I think we see more reported perhaps in the underground scene sometimes, but we do see it reported. And religious or spiritual imposition or proselytization. Right, so this can be kind of subtle and may not rise to something that is reportable most of the time, but it can also be quite overt sometimes. So the other domain that I'll discuss today is the role of psychotherapy in all of these treatments. Right now, best practice in psychedelic therapies seems to be to combine a psychedelic with some form of psychotherapeutic support. And increasingly, we're recognizing a capacity for interpersonal benefit as well as harm. And I think a really fantastic paper on this is a paper by McNamee and colleagues from last year, studying harms as key to improving psychedelic-assisted therapy. And they put it really well. It would be unimaginable for clinical trials using a combination of two drugs to only examine or regulate one of the two components. However, this is the norm in psychedelic research, in which the psychological support is neither systematized nor evaluated as in traditional psychotherapy research. And we know that adverse events, event assessment that only uses these pharmacology-derived categories typically vastly underestimates adverse events related to behavioral, lifestyle, and psychological therapies. And yet these adverse events do occur. They occur at known rates. So standard psychotherapy, we know, has adverse event rates of between 3 and 7% of patients. And again, just because you've had an adverse event doesn't mean you can't benefit from the therapy and vice versa. And these rates are typically doubled in therapies for substance use disorders. And again, these are the same conditions that we're using psychedelics for increasingly. So going back to the dismantling study that I discussed earlier, I just want to point out this is not so unusual. For example, adverse events in meditation interventions occur at rates roughly similar to what we observe in other psychotherapies like CBT. Another thing that study did is it compared different methods for monitoring adverse events, and it compared passive monitoring to specific monitoring, and consolidated that with a lot of the other literature on monitoring approaches, and found that passive monitoring generally underestimates adverse effects, in some studies up to 22-fold. And therefore concluded that tailored measures that include therapy-related and intervention-related impacts are needed. A further important concern is that psychotherapy-related harms can result from violations on the part of therapists or facilitators. And arguably, this issue has always been a part of psychedelic culture, but especially after reporting done by Symposia and the Power Trip podcast, a series of abuses in the underground psychedelic world and some concerns about legal research practice have come to light. And so kind of returning back to this ISA report that I quoted from earlier, that report focused only on the MDMA research trials makes a very pithy statement. Based on public reports, there's no question that despite the trial requiring dual treatment by one male and one female therapist, boundaries, including sexual boundaries, were severely crossed with at least one patient. We heard from multiple experts about the concerns this raises for treatment outside of clinical trials. Nearly everyone we spoke with discussed how MDMA breaks down barriers, heightens suggestibility, and creates a substantial risk with any therapist who might choose to take advantage of patients. And I think that this is something that we are talking about increasingly in the training of psychedelic therapists. I think that's a good thing. Right. And just for what it's worth, the meditation world has, of course, been well aware of a similar issue, especially in recent years, owing to victims coming forward and greater accountability in meditation communities. The abuse by a small but impactful number of meditation teachers, gurus, and leaders has become known. The power dynamics that occur in psychedelic treatment, especially if it adopts the mantle of spiritual significance and ceremonial power, can put participants in a vulnerable position with unethical facilitators. So in our work thus far, we've tried to address all of these concerns, the known psychotherapy-related challenges in the literature, and the issues that we know have come up based on reports from participants and from people who have undergone psychedelic treatments. So here is a list of psychotherapy-related adverse events that we think, again, are just important to monitor and catalog. So one is damage to the therapeutic alliance as a result of treatment, because again, we know the importance of alliance, and we know that that can lead to other worse things. Feelings of betrayal by the therapist or therapy team. Heightened therapist dependence. I can't do life without you kind of dependence, which again, we've seen come up in psychedelic care. And its inverse, feelings of abandonment, feeling abandoned by the people who you were relying on for care. Therapist abuse or exploitation, which can include financial exploitation, inappropriate touch, sexual contact, and these heightened concern about symptoms. So it can happen in a psychotherapy that you might come in for treatment of something, of one thing, and in the course of the therapy become preoccupied with something that wasn't really a major concern to begin with, which is this kind of heightened symptom concern is trying to describe. And then finally, we see this when psychedelics are sometimes described as a kind of treatment of last resort. Right, people who have, and this is not great language to use, period, people don't fail treatments, treatments fail people, but people who have failed other treatments and other strategies before, well, psychedelics can help them. But what happens if you've tried lots of different things for your depression and now you're trying psychedelics and that didn't help? And so we see this reported both among patients and also in online communities that like, well, what do I do now? So understanding adverse events is important for informed consent, for safer therapies, and for responding to these kinds of adverse events when they do occur. Yeah, there's a question from Rael.
Actually, a question from Mark.
Question from Mark.
Oh, sorry.
Do you want me to go back to the previous slide?
Well, I was gonna let you kind of wrap it up a little bit, but I'm the new guy. Okay, I'm very experienced in the underground psychedelic treatment. We've been working in it myself personally in my company for over a decade. And I'm just curious, this adverse effect you talk about, we talk about that as a benefit.
Which one?
When you rate adverse effects of psychedelics,
Yeah.
us out there in the world that's been actually working with people a lot,
Yeah.
we see those as the good journeys.
Yeah.
Because that's where the stuff comes up and that's where the healing is.
Yeah.
If we're only having these good, pretty things, that's where there's almost zero healing that we've seen. So when you're breaking the addiction, the suicidal thoughts, the things that we've seen major success, myself included, it saved my life. That's why I got in this from a 10-year struggle of Western therapies that did not stick. This stuck. And it was because I went through some very serious journeys that were very adverse.
Yeah.
But the long-term benefit was life-saving. So that's my question of like, how can you measure that long-term? Because it's actually what our belief system is, the darkness, the trauma coming back out of you and releasing is not pretty, but the long-term benefit is, I have journeys that I did 6-7 years ago that I think about literally every day that keep me on point. Does that make sense? So that's my observation as an outsider.
That's a really good observation. Is it okay if I summarize it?
For sure.
Tell me if I got it wrong.
I'll just mention, please do, but we've gotten comments from the folks on Zoom that they can hear us very well because it's so well mic'd.
Oh, okay.
So you know.
All right, I'm not going to summarize then. Fantastic. I think that's a really important point. That goes back to something that I mentioned earlier, which is that just because you have an adverse effect or an adverse event does not mean that you wouldn't benefit from the treatment. And just because you've benefited from the treatment doesn't mean that you cannot have had an adverse event. And I think that's really important to sort of separate those things out from one another. The other thing that I'll mention though, and I think that this is really important, is, I actually believe that we should center the experiences of the care seekers. So it's not up to me, and with due respect, it's not up to anybody else to figure out what it was that was beneficial and not. And we see this sort of phenomenon. We see it in the literature, that people who have had negative, challenging, difficult, distressing experiences that end up doing okay will often appraise those as having positively contributed to their lives. But the ones that aren't doing okay, they don't. And it's hard to disambiguate how much of that is just part of being psychologically healthy, is making sense of the bad stuff you experience and learning from it, drawing lessons from it, drawing powerful lessons from it. But I would say, and this is where I think the word belief system came up, and I think we need to be very explicit about those. So if someone is coming into care, we need to let them know, this is what I believe about when negative things can happen. And this is my approach. But any psychotherapy or any medical treatment where you say, well, you can have two versions of the surgery. One is going to cause incredible pain and you're going to learn a lot from it, and the other one isn't. Well, a lot of people will say, give me the one without the pain, please. And so part of monitoring this, it may be the case. And I think, I'll just add, this is an idea that I think we sometimes see that comes out of, for example, PTSD research and other areas like that, where there's kind of we need to have an increase in engagement with potentially traumatic content, with difficult content. When we sort of circumvent these patterns of avoidance, it can often be quite distressing, right?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that though. The integration is the key.
Yes.
From our from like along a lot of this is, and I'm just using, it's like taking the Etch-a-Sketch and giving you a clear shot, but you have to rewire the neural pathways every day for a long time to create new neural pathway habits, because otherwise you just go back to your OS1 program. So unless there's an integration component to this, I'm not sure how you rate this adverse effect, because if they get on a spiritual yoga practice or whatever, instead of going back to the bar, then you're gonna have a totally different, it gives you a shot, is what we're saying, if you get on a solid integration, long-term program of changing everything, right?
I think that you ask them. I think that you just ask people.
That's
And so
what I'm asking.
Yeah.
Are we, because if you just have a bad journey, that's.
Yeah, and that's.
You have a chance to reset your life where when we're caught up in the deep habits of whatever we're in, addiction or trauma, to break that is so difficult.
So I'm just gonna, that's an important thing to clarify, and I'll clarify, and then I'll continue if that's okay. But one of the, the entire system is meant for post-acute adverse effects. So we know, we actually, there's a little bit of data that suggests that people who have worse subjective, more distressing acute experiences tend to do less well in the long term, but that evidence is not very strong, and there's the relationship is not very strong. We actually don't know what leads somebody who has a negative, difficult experience, I wouldn't call it negative, a difficult experience, to improve versus deteriorate. I think the jury's still out. I'm with you. I think that a lot of what happens after is super important. We're not focusing on those acute subjective experiences. We're focusing on the not just days, but weeks, months later. And I think that is where we have to be looking at adverse effects. And actually that's coming up in some of the content I'll talk about. I actually wish I could tell you, and this is kind of part of the point I'm leading up to, I wish I could tell you the rates and the importance of these different adverse effects as they occur. But beyond knowing that they do occur based on patient reports, we don't yet know the variety or the incidence of any of these adverse effects in psychedelics beyond personal experience of folks who've had them or treated them. And that's because they haven't really been studied. So we have several projects in the works that will hopefully help to address that. So right now, our preliminary framework is being applied in one current trial and two planned trials of psychedelic assisted therapy. And so hopefully in a couple of years, I'll be able to come back here and describe what this looks like out in the world with some data. And by the way, these frameworks and the assessments that we've developed in a preliminary way to rate them and the instructions for those are available for anybody who wants to use them. We're very happy to share. We think that they're not very burdensome in the context of clinical trial research. But importantly, and I think this speaks to the question that came up just a little bit, is we've yet to translate from adverse events to adverse effects. And that is to say, we don't really know the clinical footprint of these events, which means that we treat them with tools that we've developed from other contexts. And that might include psychiatric contexts, and meditation traditions, and spiritual traditions that we use. We don't really understand the phenomenology. We don't know the extent to which they constitute known symptoms. We don't know their duration. We don't know their severity in their duration, and we don't know whether they map onto known clinical syndromes like depression, like post-traumatic stress disorder, or like anxiety disorders. And all of that remains to be seen. So one of the things that we've suggested is a kind of an agenda really largely informed by taking a close look at the meditation research. And one piece is that it has to be user informed. It has to be informed by the people who have had psychedelic related adverse effects and by experts in the field. They have to be standardized. So we have to have a good standardized way of measuring these so that we can have consistent and reliable results. They have to be based on impacts rather than the subjective valence. So how did this affect your life? And how did this affect your life in the longer term? Which I think addresses a little bit of what we were just talking about. They need to rely on unbiased assessment. So this is really an issue that has come up in meditation research a lot, but we see it persisting in the field of psychedelics, where our measures often conflate the phenomenology of the experience with its valence. Did you have a life-changingly positive mystical experience? Why, yes, I did, right? But we don't know if that merges with something greater than myself, right? If we can take the valence, the mood or the affect out of the phenomenology of it. And the same thing with the challenging experiences questionnaire. These are all items that exclusively probe negative affect. It needs to be detailed and comprehensive enough to capture the kinds of phenomena that can arise in these experiences. And we need to do this in a representative way. So research suggests that population-based studies of psychedelics, so when we give people a lot of surveys, primarily draw on people who are already fans of psychedelics, which means that we're getting biased results. They also are making the same errors that mindfulness and meditation research has been making for decades, primarily affluent, primarily educated, primarily white participants, primarily from European and American contexts. And that is not going to lead to a good generalizable science of psychedelics. We need to understand the factors that influence the impacts of negative experiences and adverse effects, and that influence people's trajectories. So absolutely, many people have a dip and then they thrive. But I've personally spoken with people who've had a dip that lasted a long time. At what point, after 3 years of struggle, do you say, well, maybe this is just not a good thing? And they have to be, for that reason, longitudinal. Right? So we have to get good data. We can't randomize people to an adverse effect condition, right? Not only is that unethical, it's also impossible, but we can borrow from disciplines that don't have the luxury of randomization, such as epidemiology, and run good longitudinal studies. And that is, in fact, what we are hoping to do in the next years. So a couple of takeaways, and again, these are my personal views, my personal perspectives. I think, it's time to do away with this idea that there's no such thing as a bad trip. This is kind of harvested from the internet. I apologize. Bad trips are good trips, but you are resistant to change or toxic behaviors. So you didn't have a bad experience. You're just a bad person. And when you realize that you've been a bad person and become a better person, and you realize that that wasn't a bad trip, it was actually a good trip, et cetera. And I just don't know how much that helps. It doesn't seem to help based on what we know about psychological treatments in general. We need to be able to recognize and address worldview strain when it occurs, when people's worldviews are rocked by these experiences. We need to practice non-imposition and respect for patients' autonomy, for our care seekers' autonomy in making sense of their experience. We have to practice in-depth and tailored assessment and provide care seeker-centered resources. So again, I'll just kind of point back to Cheetah House. There was, I recently read a blog by Jules Evans that kind of said, we need a Cheetah House for psychedelics users. And I think that that's true. We don't really know. There are some acute resources for where to send people when they're having a bad experience. But where do you send people who are really struggling and have not benefited from integration, right? I think integration is an excellent first line approach. What do you do with a patient that you've tried everything you know with, and they're not really thriving yet? They're not really improving yet. I think we need resources for that. And in all of this, I think we need to center the care seekers' narratives and their own experiences in this work. So those are my take homes, and that's the end of the presentation. Thank you so much.
Why are they care seekers and not patients?
So this is an approach that we have taken coming out of, should I cede the podium before I answer?
No, go ahead. It's after 5:30, so it's respect people's time, but go ahead.
Okay, I'll just answer why care seekers and not patients. So I work in a spiritual health program, and there's been a lot of kind of debate. I actually like the word patient. I use it a lot reflexively. You might have noticed during the talk. But not every field likes thinking of the people who come to them for help as patients. Client seems a little bit transactional. You're not necessarily a provider, and they're not necessarily a client. And so I think it just describes that relationship where they have come to you seeking care, and you are the care responder who offers care as a result. So we find that it generalizes across chaplaincy, across nursing, across psychotherapy, and across people who don't have a kind of a alphabet soup after the name, who nevertheless provide care. So I'm just gonna step aside for a second.
Thank you so much, Roman. I'll just say just a word of closing. Thank you for coming today. Some people are going to be having dinner with Roman, and maybe if you're one of those who can ask questions of him there. We didn't have time for that partly because of the answers we threw in the middle. It's partly my fault, I'm sorry. But thank you also for those who joined via Zoom. And just for information, our next talk is by a very experienced psychiatrist and transpersonal psychologist by the name of Carlos Werter, who is a Chilean psychiatrist, who is not a veteran of the psychedelic renaissance. He's a veteran of the psychedelic movement of the 60s. So he was around and very much participating in the exploration of psychedelics for human potential, as well as clinical utility and its integration with spirituality since the 60s until now, and lives in Vista, California, where he has a healing retreat center, sees patients individually, also does group work. He'll be speaking in relationship to a new book he's writing called Psychedelics and the Human Potential. And there's quite a bit about meditation and consciousness writ large in what he has to say. He'll be coming on June 10th. So hope you can come for that as well. And thank you all for being here.